In at number 10 is Franklin Richards. As the child of 2 members of Marvel's first family, the Fantastic Four, Franklin Richards came to us in comic books as a baby. So, of course he is going to change over time, but how drastically he has changed kinda surprised me. Given the nature of his reality warping abilities, Franklin has been shown to us as an adult before he had actually reached that age in the continuity. This happened a couple times. The first time he managed to age himself up to look like a blonde version of Jesus, which was hilarious and terrifying all at the same time. There was also a time he was abducted to the future and trained to become a powerful psionic hero, calling himself STARLORD, which is a stupid name. And yet another time was with Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, when future Franklin was traveling around time, interacting with different members of his family, training his younger self, and making Galactus his little herald. The funny thing is that in all those appearances and versions of himself from child to adult, he has been blonde. Now again, his powers kinda mean that he can look whatever way he decides he wants to, but nowadays he's looking a hell of a lot more like his dad, Reed Richards, than he was before. In his teens, Franklin is sporting jet black hair, being super sulky like most teenagers are, and occasionally wearing an X-Men costume, as his powers let him alter his own genes to give him an X gene, since he believed that he was a mutant. It's a subtle change, but when I first saw him looking like this in the comics, I had no idea who I was actually looking at. He is also currently depowered as far as I know, which is a little upsetting, but also makes him no longer a mutant and just a depowered human mutate, so we shall see what happens there.
Number 9. Superman. Starting out with Superman for my first point here on this list, Superman made his first appearance in Action Comics issue number 1 back in 1938. He is one of the oldest characters around and one of the most prolific. Without Superman, the modern day superhero of today may not even exist. However, over the years he's come a long way. He even managed against all odds to settle down, get married, and have a son. That is a rare thing in comics, where time often seems unmoving and endless. However, for Superman, almost nothing is impossible, the movement of life included apparently. Ending up with his love, Lois Lane, the two had a son together named John. Even when the continuity they were from came to an end, Superman and his family survived, carrying on despite the fact that he wasn't really the New 52 Superman at that time. Eventually, the New 52 Superman, who was romantically tied to Wonder Woman, would die, and Superman from the New Earth would take his place. Although technically, Superman is now kind of a combination of both of those characters, which is kind of weird to think about because Superman and Wonder Woman were together, so what does that mean? Does he remember that? I don't know. Later, we'd get a glimpse into a possible future in Future State where Superman leaves Earth and his son John Kent takes up the mantle. Currently in the comics, John is Superman, with Clark having left Earth for a time, although don't worry, Clark Kent is also still Superman. When John was revealed to be bisexual, those who weren't following comics wrongfully assumed that DC had made Clark Kent queer, when in reality, the Superman that was revealed to be bi was actually John Kent. This made crazy headlines, but I was also like, I don't think these people quite know exactly which Superman they're talking about. But on my end of the spectrum, I'm like, yay, more bi babes. Always love to see that representation myself. Also, John is just such a great character, so I'm happy to see him get a little bit more time in the spotlight. And friends, before I move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here on Top 10 Nerd, be sure to show us that you love us by clicking that like button.
In at number 8 is STARLORD. When Peter Quill first appeared in Marvel Comics in Marvel Preview number 4 from January of 1976, he might as well have been a different character. The tagline on the front of the comic reads, "He stalks the galaxies, one man on a mission of cosmic vengeance." Now that's not really the Star-Lord we are familiar with today. There's also the fact that his look was reminiscent of Owlman from the Watchmen comics. Speaking of which, he actually had a pet owl. The comic, and by extension the character, was a lot more serious and fantastical. He also had actual superpowers bestowed by the costume he wore that was given to him by this guy called the Master of the Sun. He could fly without jet boots and in space without any protection. The main things that still remained were some parts of his origin story and the fact that he wielded an elemental weapon that could shoot fire, water, earth, and air, but only one. Now you contrast this character with what most people have come to be accustomed to, and there are many glaring differences. Not even physical differences. He's a hugely different character, which was probably also influenced by a bit of Chris Pratt's humor. But even in his first appearance with the Guardians of the Galaxy, he's starkly different to his Marvel Preview days.
Number 7. Crimson Avenger. I mean, most people might not even recognize the Crimson Avenger just because they don't know him. He's quite a classic hero, appearing on what I believe was DC's second superhero team ever, the Seven Soldiers of Victory, which made their first appearance back in the early 1940s in Leading Comics issue number 1. Here, Crimson Avenger was Lee Walter Travis. He appeared here sporting a super form-fitting red outfit with a fin on top and yellow underwear over top, as well as yellow boots to match. This look would seemingly endure until Travis met his end in DC Comics Presents issue number 38. Here the question of what happened to him would be answered, and we'd learn after being diagnosed with an incurable disease, Lee decided to don his costume one more time and sacrifice himself to save others. Now, while this might sound like his original costume because it did sort of come into play super early on, his original costume, however, actually hails from even further back than the 1940s. The Crimson Avenger actually made his first appearance in the late 1930s in Detective Comics issue number 20. Here he sported a suit underneath a red cape with a matching red wide-brimmed hat and wielding dual pistols. He died back in the 80s looking very different in comparison to his first appearance, and I guess now you really wouldn't recognize him at all because I don't think we've seen a new Crimson Avenger since, with him remaining dead in regards to comic continuity. Tell me if I'm wrong on that one, but I can't think of a Prime Earth appearance that I've seen. Crimson Avenger? Is he in the Prime Earth? You tell me. Number 6. Robin. Jason Todd was once known as Robin. At the time, he was a hero, and while quite stubborn and brash, he did his best to live up to the mantle working alongside Batman. Eventually, however, Jason would end up leaving Wayne Manor and go on a search for his birth mother. During this time, Batman would once again find him just as Jason would find his birth mother. But unfortunately, the Joker would also find Batman and Jason, secretly blackmailing Jason's mother, and in the end, Jason and his mom would end up as the Joker's victims. Jason would seemingly not survive this incident despite Batman's rush to come to his aid. However, many years later, we learn with the re-emergence of Red Hood that Jason actually hadn't died here, but had managed to survive and return to life and later Gotham using his new identity, Red Hood. Gone are the days when Jason Todd acted as Batman's sidekick Robin, and in his place was Red Hood. At first a seeming villain, then an anti-hero who was unafraid to kill and fought with guns, and now currently a brutal vigilante who instead fights with a crowbar because symbolism. I actually really like Jason fighting with a crowbar, but I don't know, how do you guys feel about that? Number 5. Electro. The main Electro we've known for years is Maxwell Dillon, but there is a new Electro on the scene. This new Electro is Francine Fry. She was once the accomplice and love interest of Max, who died as a result of her love for him, and her obsession with villains and kinda her lust for them. While Max's powers were less in his control, Francine threw caution to the wind and decided to kiss him. Their kiss would result in her being electrified to death. However, she'd later be revived by Ben Reilly, operating as villain the Jackal, as part of a plot to help control Electro into basically doing his bidding. Turns out the DNA Reilly used to resurrect Francine in clone form was actually a mix of Maxwell's and her own as a result of that kiss, allowing her to harness and absorb electricity, chiefly the power of the suit that a depowered Max had at the time been given. Kissing Max once more, Francine absorbed the suit's powers, accidentally killing him in the process, and becoming the new Electro. Max has since been resurrected, so now even more confusing, we have 2 Electros technically running around.
Up next, we're taking a look at Richard Fisk, now known as the Rose. The son of Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin, Richard would boast about how rich and powerful his father was, thinking he was just a highly successful businessman. Now, even if that was the case, like, come on, don't go around boasting about your parents' accomplishments. Live your own life. Well, that's exactly what Richard decided to do. Upon discovering his father was actually the kingpin of crime, Richard faked his own death and took on the moniker of the Schemer, attempting to take down his father's empire. The two would eventually reconcile after Richard felt bad about putting his dad into a coma. Fair enough. But this brings us to Richard's next moniker, the Rose. He now sported a purple mask and kept a rose in his front pocket and worked under his father, but secretly wanted to dismantle the Kingpin's organization from within. After killing a policeman in a shootout, however, Rose just realized he was a bad dude and aligned himself with his father again, but then changed his mind and wanted to take over Kingpin's organization again. Just kill your dad or don't, man. It's a decision we all have to make at some point in our lives.
Number 3. Grey Goblin. Gabriel Stacy has been known by a few different names throughout the years, and has also had his backstory somewhat altered. Initially, we knew Gabe Stacy as Grey Goblin, and later as American Son in Age of Heroes. Originally, he was introduced to us as the son of Norman Osborn and Gwen Stacy, who basically had a secret love affair which resulted in the birth of 2 twin babies, Sarah and Gabriel Gabriel. However, when Gabriel and Sarah were revealed to be the mysterious demonic villain returning from hell, known as Kindred, we learned that they were actually never really the natural born children of Norman and Gwen, thank goodness, but instead were clones that Harry Osborn had made, using their genetic material to get back at his father, tormenting him and making him think the two were really his children, when actually they weren't. It was all Harry's plot, ha ha ha. Not only did Gabriel have a completely different look as Kindred, but he also got a completely different backstory that explained away all the weirdness of his and Sarah's original origins. Which, I mean, thank you for that, because wow, that was bad. It was not good. I don't want Norman to sleep with Gwen. I'm not here for that.
This next baseball player turned villain is known as Frederick Myers, aka Boomerang, and he's gone through several changes, having worked under criminal organizations like the Sinister Syndicate, as an assassin, going up against a number of heroes, and of course Spider-Man. So how did this boomerang wielding baddie change? Well, he ended up aiding Black Widow, Maria Hill, and the Champions in their fight against Hydra, and cut a deal to get a full pardon for all his past crimes. That's pretty sweet. He later became Peter Parker's roommate in an attempt to get closer to Spider-Man as he was attempting to find the pieces of the Lifetime tablet. Though Boomerang was lying about his true motives to Spidey, saying he was only after the tablet to keep it away from Kingpin, this was quite the opposite actually, he was working for Kingpin. Despite his deception, however, Frederick actually formed a close bond with the hero and would go on to sacrifice his own life to save him during a fight with the vampiric villain Morlun.
Number 1. Green Goblin. Norman Osborn is often known as the villain the Green Goblin, one of Spider-Man's most iconic villains, if not the most iconic rogue he happens to have in his gallery. Their rivalry is an old one, going all the way back to the first appearance of the character in the 1960s, where Osborn actually first appeared not in his civilian form, but simply as the villain Green Goblin. But lately, Norman has had a change of heart, if you can believe that. It most certainly won't last forever, or at least I'd be very surprised if it did, but currently in the comics, Norman is actually one of the good guys for a change. This is after he had all of his sins purified by the villain known as Sin Eater. Initially, Peter as Spider-Man had saved Norman from Sin Eater, but after being taunted about Gwen, couldn't help but toss Green Goblin to the villain to be devoured, which, I mean, fair enough. But instead of perishing, Norman survived the encounter, no longer driven by madness, guilt, or rage. Having been purified, he was seemingly given a new lease on life, and currently remains one of the few villains purified by Sin Eater to stay that way. At least so far. Number 10. Iron Man. I mean, Iron Man has come such a long way since that first classic appearance. He was basically just a guy in a big metal silver suit after all. Now he's a guy in, well, a big metal silver suit that isn't quite so bulky and actually has a few coats of paint on it. This is because when we first met Tony Stark as Iron Man, he was wearing his very first suit, in issue number 39 of Tales of Suspense. Here we'd get his origin story, which would explain how Tony Stark was captured and made the suit under the guise of building weapons of war for his captors, when really he was building the suit to help keep him alive and also help him in his escape. This suit, of course, was built for a specific purpose, that of survival. But over the years, Tony would modify his design and improve upon it, even building various suits for specific events as might be needed depending on the circumstances. His most iconic look, though, often still involves him wearing his slightly more modern, though still classic colors of red and yellow. He went from silver to gold to red and yellow, I believe, although now he has more modern coloring in terms of the red and yellow colors. His armor appears a lot more metallic red and gold, which I love. Although I'm sure in the classic comics it was also supposed to be metallic red and gold, but we just have more advanced, I feel like, color tech in the future. Color tech. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here on Top 10 Nerd, and if you love hearing about some heroes that, you know, you might not be as familiar with or you might not recognize anymore, we also have a playlist where we show you some alternate versions, so go see some other characters that you might not know about now. Number 9. Green Arrow. Green Arrow literally looked like Robin Hood back in the day. Well, minus the now more Robin Hood style goatee that he now sports, because back then I feel like he was usually more clean shaven. Green Arrow is Oliver Queen. Technically his first appearance is no longer even the same Ollie that we have today in the comics, instead relegated to the alternate reality of Earth 2. But still, he was the original Green Arrow, and so if we are talking about classic looks in terms of first appearances, which is exactly what I'm trying to do here, Oliver has made a lot of progress in comparison to his first look and his first self. Currently, Oliver Queen in the Prime Earth main continuity of DC Comics has a much more modern look to him. Well, of course, like I said, minus that classic looking goatee and mustache combo, which is very Robin Hood to me. No longer does he wear a bright green suit with red boots and gloves. Instead, he wears body armor that, while still kinda green, is much more muted in tone. And sometimes he wears reddish bracers, which is kind of a throwback to the classic look, but even then, the colors are about where we draw the line when it comes to similarities to that classic look. Well, and obviously he still fights with a bow, because he is Green Arrow, but that I don't think will ever change. That would be weird if he was like, and now I'm Green Arrow, but I fight with a machete. I'd be like, that's really random, but alright. Unless it's a machete that he can like shoot like an arrow. Number 8. Thor. Thor has always looked super classic when it comes to his Norse heritage, but now he looks even more cosmic, despite really having always been, as the Asgardians are not people from the past but are instead considered to be aliens of a kind, simply posing as gods on Midgard, aka Earth, where humans once prayed to Odin and the others. I'm sure some still do, seeing them as godlike figures. I mean, in essence, they are still considered gods, but they're also aliens, because they're, you know, cosmic, but also divine. I would say that over the years, Thor's stories and overall appearance and costume have also greatly embraced his cosmic origins more and more. Thor also made his first appearance in Journey into Mystery issue number 83, where he also looked a mite smaller compared to his modern day self. I feel like that Thor is so like, the Thor we have now is like, oh, he's like super deezed. And especially if we consider the Thor and Hulk crossover event Banner of War, Thor also hulks out here himself and even shattered the Bifrost again after becoming infected by Bruce Banner. So there he might look totally different, because you'd be like, what? Thor's the Hulk? What's happening? Number 7. Elongated Man. Elongated Man is a character whose design has been pretty consistent since his first appearance in The Flash issue 112, even now in the comics. But there was a time when his appearance was totally different, and you know, you may have not recognized him there. This happened after Ralph Dibny and Sue Dibny, his wife, died, and then they became ghosts for a bit. But not just ghosts, ghost detectives. Admittedly, as ghosts, Sue and Ralph do look like themselves, but just as civilians in a spectral form. So even though Ralph does look like Ralph, you still might have not recognized him or Sue during their ghostly appearance, because I mean, they were ghosts. It was a cool and short-lived time, and I like to talk about it because I love the idea of ghost detectives. I wish we got more of that. To check out Sue and Ralph in their ghostly forms, you can refer to issue number 52 of the 52 comic series.
In at number 6 is Blue Beetle. I will be honest, Blue Beetle kind of flew under my radar for a very long time. I either simply didn't care about him, or I just hadn't really known he existed. I don't know which one it was, but it was definitely one of those, and seeing the costume that the original Blue Beetle wore kind of makes me think that maybe it was the first option. That costume absolutely sucked. It was bland as hell, and it was basically just Dan Garrett in some leggings and an oversized shirt, a stupid looking cowl looking thing, and a bad domino mask. It was during World War II, so we're gonna blame this on material shortages, but every Blue Beetle outfit has been an improvement and redesign of this costume. But now with Jaime Reyes, the Blue Beetle armor is not just way more advanced and capable, but it looks leagues and bounds better than the original. So much so that it's hard to even draw comparisons between the two. Now if we put these suits up side by side and change the colors of one of them, almost no one would believe that one was an evolution of the other. So much better now, thank the Lord.
Number 5. Killer Croc. We got our first look at Waylon Jones, aka Killer Croc, in Detective Comics number 524. In this version, he had a medical condition that gave his skin a rough, scaly appearance, earning him the nickname Killer Croc. In his first appearance, Croc is actually pretty cunning, being able to rise almost to the top of the Gotham underworld. His physical appearance is also pretty tame, being gray and scaly but still clearly a human being. As he made subsequent appearances, not only did he get dumber, but his look became more and more exaggerated until he eventually looked like an actual crocodile, with green scales, sharp teeth, and sometimes even a tail. His size in the original comics is large, but still within believable human proportions, whereas at this point, he is so tall that it's hard to imagine any skin condition resulting in a villain like Croc. Number 4. The Green Goblin. Arguably Spider-Man's greatest foe is the Green Goblin. First appearing all the way back in Amazing Spider-Man number 14, the Green Goblin had a pretty consistent look look for most of his career, sporting a purple and green costume with a horrifying, grinning goblin mask with a purple hat. He flies around on a bat-shaped glider and throws exploding pumpkins at Spidey. Over the years, Norman Osborn has had a few different aliases and therefore costumes, such as the Iron Patriot and the Goblin King, but it's usually not long before he's back in the green duds. More recently though, he's trying to be a hero and is wearing a white and gold bodysuit and going by the name Gold Goblin. The glider kinda gives it away, but based purely on the costume, would you think this is the same guy? If that's not different enough for you, just take a look at the Green Goblin in the Ultimate Universe, where he is more like a Hulk than the classic villain. Number 3. Victor Fries. This classic Batman villain was very different in his first appearance in Batman Volume 1, number 121. He was a scientist who suffered an accident that forced him to wear a specialized cryosuit that kept his body temperature below freezing. He soon began committing crimes not as Mr. Freeze, but as Mr. Zero. His original look was a green and pink bodysuit with a bubble-shaped helmet feeding him cold air. When the character was adapted for the 60s television show, he was renamed Mr. Freeze, and this name eventually was brought over into the comics. His look began to evolve closer to how we now know him, but he remained a rather C-list villain until the 90s animated series revamped his origin to be a tragic figure trying to find a cure for his sick wife. This interpretation was so popular that it was also brought into the comics. The character is now very different from his original appearances, but it is interesting to see how much he has changed over the years due to his adaptations in other media. Number 2. Catwoman. I know, there are a lot of Batman villains on this list, but that is mostly because they tend to be a much more consistent group of villains than a lot of other heroes have, and also because they're the best comic book rogues gallery by a country mile. First appearing all the way back in Batman number 1 in 1940, Catwoman was very similar to her modern personality, being a brazen and flirtatious cat burglar. In this first story, however, she doesn't dress as a cat, but instead uses various disguises to steal a jeweled necklace from a boat and is simply known as the Cat. In her next appearance in Batman number 2, she is still not wearing a full-on costume, but is referred to as Catwoman for the first time. When she shows up again in Batman number 3, she finally gets a costume consisting of a long flowing yellow dress, a red cape, and a literal cat head mask. In Batman number 35, her costume evolves more into something that we today would recognize as Catwoman, with a purple dress, green cape, and less intense cat mask. The look stayed the same after that for a few decades until the comics took some inspiration from her look in the 60s TV show, and she ended up in the skin-tight catsuit that has evolved into the look we all know and love today. Number 1. Thunderbolt Ross. For most of his history, since Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross first appeared in Incredible Hulk number 1, he has remained pretty much the same. He's an angry mustachioed general obsessed with capturing or killing the Hulk. He stayed this way for decades, being a constant antagonist in the Hulk stories, but the status quo changed in 2008 when he joined the group of villains known as the Intelligentsia, who helped transform Ross into the Red Hulk. Since then, Red Hulk has been both villain and hero, but if you saw the original Ross next to the Red Hulk, you would have no reason to suspect that they are one and the same. Number 10. Harley Quinn. Harley Quinn was created in the classic 90s Batman animated series where she was the Joker's main henchwench and girlfriend. She proved so popular that she was brought into the main comic book continuity, where she was dressed pretty much the same as she was in the animated show, with a red and black jester costume. Over the years, both her look and personality have evolved as she has broken away from the Joker and become her own person, who is a bit more of an anti-hero at this point. Although her color scheme has remained the same, she now has a bit more of a wild look, wearing a red and black corset and leather jacket, letting her blonde hair with dyed pigtails flow free. It is a major difference, but there are other characters who have changed even more, which is why Harley is at the bottom of this list. Number 9. Paste Pot Pete. Originally, Pete used a glue gun to commit robberies while dressed in this rather strange green jumpsuit and purple beret. Paste Pot Pete is really Peter Petruski, a scientist who developed an advanced adhesive that made him very wealthy. However, he believed that a life of crime would be even more lucrative and began robbing banks and stealing missiles. He updated his costume a couple times, going for a more purple pouchy theme, and ended up changing his name to the Trapster after Spider-Man burst into hysterical laughter upon hearing the name Paste Pot Pete. He made some minor updates to his look in the following years, but eventually settled on a yellow and brown outfit that he still wears in his most recent appearance. None of of his looks are particularly menacing, but if I saw his first look side by side with his second look and was told that one was called Paste Pot Pete and the other the Trapster, I would have no reason to think that they were the same villain, other than both using a similar weapon. But at the same time, so do Captain Cold and Mr. Freeze. Number 8. Hawkeye. In his first appearance in Tales of Suspense number 57, Clint Barton was a carnival worker who performed incredible trick shots with arrows. When the audience was unimpressed with his performance and booed him off stage, he became jealous when he saw Iron Man show up to save the day when one of the rides went haywire, much to the crowd's delight. He thinks to himself, "I'm the greatest marksman the world has ever known, and yet they ignore me." He decides that if he makes himself a few trick arrows, he will be just as respected as Iron Man, because a guy in a purple tunic and mask shooting arrows is just as impressive as a flying weaponized robot suit. He becomes a supervillain, going toe-to-toe with Iron Man. In the years since his first appearance, Hawkeye has gone from supervillain to superhero and has had multiple identities and costumes, but in his most recent appearances, he has traded his more flashy masked look for what is essentially just a black t-shirt with a purple arrow on it and some sunglasses. Without the context of the many years of stories between his first and most recent appearances, not only would you be confused as to his very different look, you'd also be surprised at how a supervillain is now one of the most frequent members of the Avengers.
Number 7. Kane Parker. Kane Parker was initially a clone of Spider-Man who, yes, was considered to be, kinda evil. Chiefly because Kane didn't have any qualms with killing people, leaving them with his mark of Kane, which typically was used to kinda like burn the face of his victims. And also because he had long hair and was more moody than Spider-Man, which is a feat because Spider-Man's a pretty moody dude. In reality, the mark of Kane was actually just Kane using his spider climbing like little hooks on his hand, as we saw showcased visually in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, to burn his victims' faces. Kane was also seen as evil because he was mentally unstable, having been a defective clone who was rapidly deteriorating, which basically affected his mind. However, Kane is now known as Scarlet Spider and has a completely different look and attitude when compared to his original appearance and presentation in the comics. While still being, you know, somewhat edgy because he's still Kane, he's definitely still more of a hero now in the comics than he ever was before.
The original Super Adaptoid, created by Advanced Idea Mechanics, or AIM, was originally a villain facing off against Captain America, Iron Man, of course the Avengers, also going up against the X-Men. It was able to mimic and visually copy anything it wanted, giving it a hero's abilities and powers. But in Amazing Spider-Man 900, however, Spidey faces off against a different version of this shape-shifting entity known as the Sinister Six Adaptoid. This version of the character sports a brand new look, most prominently featuring Doc Ock's tentacles, but there are other visual elements in the character's design as well. The Sinister Six Adaptoid is an amalgamation of sorts of, you guessed it, the Sinister Six, having the abilities of Doc Ock, Vulture, KRAVEN, Mysterio, Sandman, and Electro. The Sinister Six had been captured by the Living Brain, and their powers and sentience combined to form the villain. So if you thought these guys were strong on their own, imagine going up against all of them at once. Spider-Man actually needed help the real Sinister Six in order to take this abomination down. Go figure. Also, I love when villains like team up with the hero just to like, because they both hate the same person. It's just fun.
Number 5. Icarus. If we compare Icarus's first appearance to his latest appearance in the comics, you'll definitely see a pretty big transformation. If we're just going with that first appearance. Icarus makes his first appearance in issue number 1 of the Eternals, and while his golden locks may stay the same, his outfit has developed a lot more since what we see him in that first issue. We see him both disguised in civilian clothes and basically potentially wearing a little loincloth and booties, if he's the man flying across the panel that I'm thinking of. I'm pretty sure that's him. That guy also has golden locks and a similar look to Icarus, or at least the attire that he is wearing has a similar look. It's pretty limited though. Icarus in modern comics, whether we're talking about Kieran Gillen's latest and greatest Eternal series or the AXE Judgment Day event, wears a lot more clothes now. Although I will admit, on that first issue of Eternals, there is a little picture of him in his outfit. So sure, but I'm more talking about what happens in the issue. His civilian disguise, the sunglasses, the hat. More recently as well, his adaptation in the Marvel Cinematic Universe has him looking quite different additionally, where he was played by Richard Richard Madden, showcasing him as a brunette instead of the more literal golden-locked golden boy. That iteration of the character also wore more blue and gold than his comic book counterpart, who lately is often draped in blue and red colors. That's more Icarus in the comics. I guess they had to get the gold in there somewhere, you know what I mean? Number 4, The Flash. The Flash is not even the same person as he was originally. He isn't even from the same Earth either. Initially, Jay Garrick was the Flash, appearing back in Flash Comics issue number 1. Later on, a new Flash would be introduced to us, and we learned that the original Flash, Jay Garrick, actually existed on another world, known as Earth 2. Barry Allen's Flash would first appear back in the 1950s in Showcase issue number 4, and would continue to be a recurring mainstay in the comics throughout his history, up until today, where Barry is still around even now, and for many people he's still the Flash. Today, however, the more prominent Flash, I would say, currently in comics, is Barry's nephew, Wally West. That's my Flash, but you know, I respect people that prefer Barry. Wally West as well is a completely different person and also happens to look totally different in terms of his outfit in comparison to the original Flash, Jay Garrick. All in all, the Flash has come a long way throughout the character's history, and while these are just the 3 main Flashes, the Flash family would also grow exponentially over time. So while they all might not be known as the Flash, there are also just tons of speedsters who are related to the Flashes running around. In fact, we should probably do a Flash family attempting to explain video, or a Speed Force attempting to explain video. That in and of itself, that concept, very interesting. Number 3, the Wasp. You might not recognize Janet Van Dyne anymore because I feel like, well, it's been a minute since we've actually seen her as a hero in the comics. Correct me if I am wrong, because I really want to be wrong on this, as you know, I haven't read everything, but I feel like Janet has been missing for quite a while in the comics, unless I'm wrong. Which is kind of surprising, considering she was originally one of the mainstays on the Avengers. I've seen her appear as a friend to Jen and She-Hulk in her civilian form when she lent Jen an apartment, and I know she was dating Iron Man kinda recently, but that's about all I can think of when it comes to Wasp. And I mean, she's not dating Iron Man now because he was with Hellcat, I think, last I checked. What is Iron Man's dating history? It's so strange. Fortunately, Jan is getting her own solo series. Well, she's gonna share it, but you know, the Wasp is getting their own solo series. Possibly the very first Wasp solo series ever as of 2023, which seems crazy to me. I hope I'm wrong on that one. This series will be shared with Nadia Van Dyne, who is also currently known as the Wasp in the comics. Janet first appeared in issue number 44 of Tales to Astonish alongside Ant-Man, and since then has had quite the evolution when it comes to her look, ditching the Ant-Man coordinated red for a bright yellow and black suit. Nadia also is technically a totally new character who took up the mantle, so totally different person. Despite her full name, she is the daughter of Hank Pym from his first marriage, who grew up imprisoned in Russia. After escaping and coming to America, she learned that her father was dead, but Janet still lived. Bonding with her stepmother, Nadia was inspired to take up her last name instead, which she did with Jan's blessing. Also becoming known as a hero, the Unstoppable Wasp, which also obviously Janet was like, yeah, you can be the Wasp, I'm cool with it. Number 2, Green Lantern. Green Lantern, like the Flash, isn't even really the same person anymore if we are comparing modern day to classic. In fact, unlike the Flash in the main continuity event, Green Lantern has more than one modern counterpart. Who was the original Green Lantern? Well, that would be Alan Scott. Alan Scott made his first appearance in All-American Comics issue number 16, where he looked very different from our modern day Green Lanterns, and at the same time even kind of was a completely different Green Lantern in terms of, you know, where his powers came from and kinda how they worked, at least until later on when his power's origin was somewhat retconned. The modern day Green Lantern I'm sure most would think of is Hal Jordan, but there has also been Guy Gardner, John Stewart, Kyle Rayner, Jessica Cruz, and more recently Joe Moline, one of my favorite Green Lanterns, and that's just some of the mainstays of the Green Lanterns who hailed from Earth. There are a lot more as well. We've really expanded on Green Lanterns. So now when you say Green Lantern, I feel like instead of people being like, oh yeah, Alan Scott, or oh yeah, Hal Jordan even, people are like, which one are we talking about? Number 1, Miss Marvel. Miss Marvel was originally introduced to us in the comics as Carol Danvers in the late 60s. Carol herself worked with the US military as a member of the Air Force before becoming a security officer for NASA. It was there that she would meet her superheroic mentor and at one point her love interest, Mar-Vell. Eventually, Carol would get powers of her own in the 70s, debut as a superhero herself known as Miss Marvel. Based on that first appearance of the heroic character, we've come a long way in terms of her appearance, and even who she is as a person. Carol isn't even Miss Marvel anymore, having gone on to take up the much passed around mantle of Captain Marvel, in honor of the late Marvel himself. Although, as I said, it wouldn't just be Carol and Marvel that would use the name Captain Marvel. With Miss Marvel available though, Carol ended up giving her blessing for Kamala Khan, Carol's #1 fan, to use the mantle as she started on her own heroic journey. In the comics, Kamala is known as an Inhuman with the power to basically modify her form and shapeshift to an extent.
So we're all familiar with Trapster, right? Peter Petrusky, the incredibly intelligent chemist who fights with pretty much a high-powered glue gun as well as other adhesives. Well, there's a mysterious woman taking on his moniker. Not much is known about this new Trapster, but she's actually the third person to take on this name. Cool thing about her is that she ditched the E in Trapster because who needs the E? It's 2022. It just looks cooler. This version of Trapster first appeared rudely interrupting a fight between Spider-Man and Vulture, and she robbed the winged villain of money he had just stolen. This may have seemed like a good thing, but she didn't give the money back. She's now a member of the all-female crime syndicate, the Sinister Syndicate, having been recruited by Beetle.
Number 9. Sin Eater. Sin Eater is Stanley Carter. While his costume may have remained somewhat the same, actually pretty much the same, his appearance more recently in the comics drastically changed after he was resurrected by Kindred, who were actually revealed to be the twins. The twins being Sarah and Gabriel Stacy, who in turn were revealed to be clones created from the genetic materials of Gwen Stacy and Norman Osborn. So, not their naturally born offspring. Yay. Then, Sin Eater died, then was resurrected again. The second time Stanley was brought back after he'd taken his own life, he appeared in a zombie-like state, making him almost unrecognizable from his usual appearance, barring the fact that his costume has remained pretty much the same since his first appearance. Although, after rising from the grave the second time, his costume is pretty tattered, so I really think some people might have been like, who dis?
So, as we stated before, there is a new channel we have out now called Most Amazing Top 10 Anime, so if you're into that sort of thing, give us a follow and subscribe. We're putting out videos every day. This next master of the hunt is the ruthless son of Sergei Kravenov, simply known as KRAVEN the Hunter, the last son of KRAVEN. Sergei Kravenov, the original KRAVEN, wanted to carry on his legacy, so instead of having more children, because that would just take too long, plus he already has a daughter, he decided to create a whole lot of clones of himself, 87 to be exact, and attempted to train them in the ways of the hunt. Well, this current KRAVEN got his title by murdering all his brothers, which, hey, if you want to prove you're the apex predator, killing 87 clones of KRAVEN the Hunter is a great way to start your career, isn't it? He also saved the skulls and brought them before his proud dad. The son made his dad even more proud when he strangled his father to death while he was disguised as Spider-Man, thereby breaking his curse of immortality. The son has now taken on his father's moniker, KRAVEN the Hunter, as well as his actual name. Good job, buddy.
Number 7. The Riddler. Since his first appearance in Detective Comics number 140, the Riddler's gimmick has remained pretty much the same. He is hyper intelligent and uses elaborate traps, puzzles, and of course riddles to prove that he is smarter than the Batman. His look has remained pretty consistent across media, with him wearing a green spandex bodysuit covered in question marks for much of his career. Other times, when he's feeling dapper, he wears a green suit and bowler hat. This has been his look in almost every comic, and when he was first adapted for live action in the 1960s television show, Frank Gorshin's costume felt ripped right from the pages of the comics, with him alternating between the spandex and green suit looks. When Jim Carrey took over the role for Batman Forever, it was very much the same. Even when the character showed up in Gotham, he was pretty faithful to the character's original look. However, when Matt Reeves decided to take a more grounded approach to the character in the recent The Batman movie, he had Paul Dano's Riddler in an unrecognizable style. Gone were the spandex, and in its place was a green raincoat and a winter combat mask. You know, it's funny, when I watched this movie with my parents, they hadn't seen any of the marketing, and when Riddler showed up in the opening moments of the film, it wasn't until they saw his first riddle that they realized who he was. It's a bold new look for a bold new take on the character, but if Riddler shows up in a sequel, I wouldn't mind if he went just a touch more classic with his look now that he's an established villain. I mean, there's nothing really that heightened about a guy wearing a green suit jacket. Number 6. METALLO. John Corbin was a very minor Superman villain who first appeared in Action Comics number 252 in 1959. In this story, he was a regular man who was in a car accident before being transformed by a scientist into a robot covered with foam latex which looked like flesh. He was given a kryptonite-powered heart and he soon clashed with the Man of Steel. In his first appearance, he's just a guy with a pencil mustache wearing a suit, and there's nothing really notable about him. In fact, he dies in his first appearance. Once the New Earth continuity began, a revamped version of the character was introduced with probably his most iconic look. He was still a regular-looking guy, but usually his skin would soon get torn off, and he would be seen as a menacing metal skeleton, not unlike the Terminator. In more recent appearances, he's in a more bulky mech suit with glowing green components. He is quite an underrated villain, but if you saw the current version or the skeleton version next to the original guy in a suit version, you'd have no reason to suspect all three were the same character.
Number 5. Wonder Girl. Wonder Girl is great, and we don't honestly talk about her enough. But I guess what I should really say in regards to this list is the Wonder Girls are great. While initially the first Wonder Girl appeared as a younger version of Diana Prince in Wonder Woman issue 105 in 1959, I think the more common Wonder Girl we all think of when the moniker is mentioned, or at least most of us think of, I definitely think of, is Donna Troy. Donna Troy made her first appearance in The Brave and the Bold issue number 60 in 1965, and her look has come a long way since then. But also, she's not the only Wonder Girl anymore. There's also now Cassie Sandspark, and the more recent addition from the Brazilian Amazon, Yara Flor, with each of these Wonder Girls possessing their own very unique look.
And at number 4 is Daredevil. Since some of you guys hated that Amanda used superhero names that were taken up by another character for part 1, I'm gonna be a massive troll and do it again. Know why I don't care? Because the costume that Elektra dons when she assumes the Daredevil name is freaking awesome. I absolutely love this costume. It is different enough from any of Matt Murdock's costumes to make you look twice or 3 times, but retains elements that make it clear that this is still Daredevil. That point is actually a combo because Elektra has also never looked like this before either, so wham bam, there you go. Now, her time as Daredevil was honestly somewhat short, but in my eyes, it was kind of iconic. So much so that I believe her time with the costume did transfer over some elements to the most recent iteration of Matt's costume. Now he's got that sweet neck scarf hood thing going on with the more athletic looking pants. It's much more of a ninja inspired look, and I personally will take it over his classic look any day. Sorry, not sorry.
Number 3. Robin. On my part 1 for this list, I talked about Jason Todd's Robin, but many of the characters that we originally knew as Robin have changed over the years when it comes to their appearance. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about how all the Robins are technically different people, which could be confusing to people that have read different eras of different comics. We won't do that again, although I already did it with Superman, so you might be coming for me anyways. But for this point on this list, we're going to be talking about one of the most classic Robins, Dick Grayson. I would say actually the most classic Robin. Dick Grayson was the first Robin, and not only has his look changed, his whole identity and main location has as well. Dick Grayson would eventually grow up to become a hero in his own right, Nightwing. While trained by Batman and definitely seeing Bruce as someone he looked up to, Dick ultimately branched out on his own, even going on to form the Teen Titans. Later, just the Titans, because you know, they're no longer teenagers, and leading the team all on his own as well, which is pretty impressive. As Nightwing, Dick currently tends to operate more often in Bloodhaven, a city outside of, but I believe a short distance away from Gotham, with its own crime and corruption to deal with, that in some ways makes it seem even more bleak than Gotham.
And at number 2 is Bucky Barnes. This is probably one of the biggest and most drastic changes of most comic book characters. I think the only thing that stays the same is the domino mask. Even the man underneath the mask has changed. When Bucky Barnes first came into Marvel Comics in 1940, he was the young sidekick to Captain America with his star-spangled belt, blue shorts over top of his bread-right skin-tight pants, and the stylish bright blue jacket with the yellow collar. A classic look not reminiscent of Robin at all. At least, he wasn't showing as much skin as Robin did sometimes. His outfit was at least somewhat more believable than Robin's, given he was operating in World War II. But that was then. If you showed someone who'd only ever read the old stories a picture of what Bucky Barnes looks like now, they would have no idea what had happened. I mean, we got long, edgy hair, a whole lot more muscle, a pretty much all black and gray tactical look, sometimes with a face mask to cover his mouth and nose, with a hell of a lot of firepower, and oh yeah, his whole left arm is now a metal cybernetic replacement. it. It's a huge difference, but it goes with everything the character has been through, which is a lot. He's a much more sympathetic character, but also such a complete badass.
And finally, number 1, Ben Reilly. Ben Reilly was originally known as a hero in the comics. He is the clone of Spider-Man, who also acted as a hero and at one point was mistaken as being the real Peter Parker. For a while, we weren't sure who was the real Peter Parker. For a time, Ben Reilly was a main character we'd also follow along with in the comics. He would also go on to take up his own superhero identity, becoming the Scarlet Spider, before Kane took that name, that is. Since the old days though, Ben has become more dark and complex, even becoming known as the villain Jackal. More recently, he's become Spider-Man, but once again has fallen into the tempting pit of villainy, after literally falling into a pit of green ooze. And his look, while definitely Spider-Man inspired, is much different now, with him being known by the villainous mantle of Chasm. This name comes from the memories of Peter's that Ben lost, as well as some of his own unique memories which were also lost, which sit like a great chasm in his mind, hence the name Chasm.